For 20 years, she lived in the shadow of a man admired by everyone, helping to build an empire while being treated only as an elegant and silent presence. When she was replaced by the Mistress and saw her own marriage being erased as if it had never existed, everyone believed she would leave humiliated, defeated, and forgotten. But on the day the new couple decided to celebrate their victory before the elite, the woman who seemed broken emerged with a calmness so terrifying that it changed the atmosphere of the entire party, and it was enough for her to put her hands on the microphone to transform a luxurious wedding into the beginning of a ruin that no one in that room would ever be able to forget. Before hearing this story of betrayal, power, and silent revenge, subscribe to the channel to follow more intense and surprising accounts. The ballroom of the Hotel Fasano was illuminated like a jewel displayed in a shop window, and Renata Vasconcelos knew exactly the effect she caused by entering through that door. It wasn't vanity, it was awareness. 2 decades beside a man like Eduardo Vasconcelos taught her that appearance was the first language of power, and that mastering this language was the difference between existing and being remembered. She was 46 years old, with black hair cut with surgical precision at shoulder length, and a posture that many confused with coldness. It wasn't coldness, it was restraint. The distinction, for her, was fundamental. The opening party of the São Paulo Business Forum took place every August at the same address, and Renata had never missed it. She had organized the first 3 events personally when Eduardo's company was still struggling to establish itself among the greats. She had chosen the suppliers, negotiated the contracts, decided even the temperature of the air conditioning so that the guests would feel comfortable without noticing that the comfort had been calculated. It was this type of work that she did, and that no one saw. Eduardo had found her 22 years ago, when she still signed business consulting projects with her own name and had a schedule busier than his. He was brilliant, seductive, and ambitious with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She recognized in that man the type of force that needed direction so as not to destroy itself, and she believed, for a long time, that it was she who provided that direction. The marriage was fast, the merger inevitable. She went on yielding her own projects, her own clientele, her own professional identity in slices so small that when she realized it, there was nothing left to yield. All that remained was the role of wife of the founder of Vasconcelos Holdings, a group that controlled developers, real estate funds, and stakes in 4 different sectors of the São Paulo economy. On that August night, Eduardo arrived at the ballroom 10 minutes after her, as always. It was an old strategy. She prepared the ground. He reaped the applause. But this time, there was something different in the way he entered. There was a lightness that she didn't recognize, an inattention in his eyes when they crossed hers for a fraction of a second before looking away to the other side. Renata took a glass of champagne and went to greet the board members, the international partners, the wives she knew by first name and by habits. She smiled naturally, asked about children and trips, made the right comments at the exact time. While she talked, she observed, she saw when Christian Melo arrived. 34 years old, public relations director of the holdings since the previous year, Christian had the type of presence that filled a room without asking permission. Tall, dressed in a model that balanced discretion and seduction with the precision of someone who had studied both concepts. She greeted the guests with a familiarity that did not match the position. It was not the familiarity of an efficient employee. It was something else. Renata noticed the moment Eduardo perceived Christian's entrance. The angle of his body changed slightly. The laughter he let out in conversation with a Portuguese investor gained 1/10 more enthusiasm. They were signs too small for any other observer, but Renata had spent 2 decades deciphering Eduardo Vasconcelos. She knew every inflection of that man as if she had helped to write him, because, to a certain extent, she actually had. She said nothing. She finished the conversation with elegance, apologized with a smile, and went to the window that looked out onto Rua Oscar Freire. From the 12th floor, São Paulo pulsed with the characteristic indifference of big cities, that capacity to contain millions of simultaneous stories without being impressed by any of them. Renata breathed slowly. It was not the first time she felt that weight, but it was the first time the weight had a name and a face. In the following months, she went on collecting evidence with the same meticulousness she applied to any professional project. Not out of masochism, but because she needed certainties before acting, and Renata Vasconcelos had never acted without having certainty. It was a principle that her grandfather, Antonio Braga, had taught her when she was still in her early 20s and worked in the family offices in Santo André. Antonio Braga was a man who had built a modest fortune from a medium-sized construction company and who understood money with the specific wisdom of someone who one day had none. He always said that wealth without structure was mist, beautiful from afar, non-existent up close, and that every intelligent woman should have a safe that no man knew how to open. Renata had taken this instruction seriously. Long before any suspicion, long before Christian Mello, she had created that safe, not of metal, of numbers, of stakes, of patience. But on that August night at the Fasano, while she observed the silent traffic down below through the window, she still didn't know how far that safe would take her. She still didn't know that what seemed to be the beginning of the end was, in fact, the first act of something much larger. She was still learning the dimension of what she had built without realizing she was building it. Eduardo approached her at 11 at night, when the ballroom was already more dispersed and the champagne had fulfilled its social function. He placed his hand on the lower part of her back with the mechanical gesture of someone repeating a movement by inertia. "I have a headache," he said. "We can leave early." Renata looked at him for a second before responding. "Of course," she said. And she smiled with the same calmness she used for everything. In the car back to the apartment on Alameda Santos, he stayed on the phone the whole way. She looked out the window and thought of her grandfather, of the construction company in Santo André, of the invisible safe that had taken years to set up, and she felt, for the first time with absolute clarity, that she was no longer waiting for love. She was waiting for the right moment. The months that followed that night at the Fasano were a sequence of small confirmations that Renata went on storing with the coldness of someone cataloguing documents. There was no longer any doubt. The question now was another. What to do with the certainty? Eduardo began to travel with a frequency that did not match the company's schedule. Renata knew the holdings calendar better than any director because she had helped to build it over the years. She knew when there were meetings in Brasilia, when the Portuguese partners visited São Paulo, when the regional boards met, and she knew, therefore, when the trips had no justification recorded anywhere. She didn't make scenes. She didn't ask questions. She continued appearing at the right dinners, wearing the appropriate dresses, being the elegant and silent extension that her husband needed to sustain the image of a complete man. Meanwhile, she observed Christian Mello with the attention of a researcher before an unprecedented phenomenon. Christian was intelligent. Renata recognized that without difficulty. She had a genuine talent for public relations, an instinct for narrative that made her effective in her role. But there was an ingenuity in her that Renata identified from the start. Christian believed that conquering the man was enough to conquer the power he represented. It was an old mistake, committed by women who confused access with ownership. Renata had committed a different version of the same mistake. She had built her husband's power believing that, by doing so, she was building her own. It took time to understand that delegated power is not power, it is service. And service without a contract has no value. It was during a September afternoon, while reviewing old documents in the office she maintained discreetly, on a floor of the Braga family building in downtown São Paulo, that she found the first fund statements. The Braga Vasconcelos Patrimonial Fund, established 17 years ago based on a precise instruction from her grandfather, had grown in a way that she herself had underestimated. The combination of regular contributions, reinvestment of dividends, and a strategy of gradual purchase of holdings shares had transformed what began as a protection reserve into something of much larger proportions. Renata stood still before the numbers for a long moment. She called Felipe Drummond, the lawyer who had managed the fund since the beginning, a 60-year-old man who had been her grandfather's legal partner for 3 decades and who treated confidentiality as a second religion. "Felipe," she said when he answered, I need a consolidated report of all stakes, complete, with the intermediate holdings and the real percentages. 2 days later, she had the report in her hand, and it took her an hour to completely comprehend what the numbers meant. Over 17 years, buying shares in small blocks through different legal vehicles, she had accumulated a stake that, combined, exceeded that of any other individual shareholder in the company. Eduardo was the founder, the face, the name. But the shareholding control had slipped from his hands in slow motion, without him realizing it, because he had never considered the possibility that his silent and obedient wife could have a strategy of her own. Renata closed the report, went to the office window and looked at the Viaduto do Char down below. She felt something that took a moment to name. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was the specific sensation of someone who realizes they were prepared for a war that had not yet been declared. The declaration came 3 weeks later, on an October afternoon, in the apartment on Alameda Santos. Eduardo arrived home in the early afternoon, which was unusual. She was working on the balcony with a sustainability report she was reviewing for one of the boards in which she participated voluntarily. He sat in the chair in front of her, which was also unusual. Normally, he didn't sit. He was always in motion, always in a hurry for the next appointment. "I need to talk to you," he said. She placed the report on the table carefully, looked at him, waited. Eduardo did what men like him usually do in these situations. He went straight to the point, with a brutality that he disguised as honesty. He said the marriage had become a formality years ago. He said he had found something true with another person. He said his lawyers had prepared a fair and generous separation proposal, a penthouse in Jardins, a substantial amount in cash, and a monthly pension that would keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. He said he hoped she understood that this was better for both of them. Renata listened to him until the end, without interrupting him once. When he finished, she stayed in silence for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Thank you for the honesty," and added with the same tone of someone commenting on the weather, "Send the papers when they are ready." Eduardo blinked. It was evident that he had rehearsed for a different reaction. Her serenity disconcerted him in a way that he didn't know how to completely disguise. He left the apartment 20 minutes later, with the posture of someone who expected to have closed a chapter, and discovered, without quite understanding how, that he had only turned a page. Renata stayed on the balcony for another hour after he left. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She kept looking at the rooftops of Jardins while the afternoon cooled slowly, and thought of her grandfather, of Felipe Drummond, of the numbers in the report. And she thought that Eduardo was about to discover that generosity, when it comes from a position of ignorance, is not generosity. It is only the price that someone is willing to pay for what they believe it is worth. He still didn't know what it was worth, but soon he would. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a motorcycle courier with the characteristic impersonality of transactions that someone prefers not to face personally. Renata signed for the receipt, placed the envelope on the kitchen counter, and went to prepare coffee before opening it. The proposal was exactly what Eduardo had described, a 300-square-meter penthouse in Pinheiros, already with the deed in her name, plus a cash value that would represent what any financial analyst would call a generous solution for a 22-year divorce. There was also the confidentiality clause, drafted with the specific care of someone who wants to ensure that certain conversations never reach certain ears. Renata read every paragraph with attention, drinking coffee in the dim light of the morning. When she finished, she put the document back in the envelope and called Felipe Drummond. They met that afternoon in the downtown office. Felipe was a man who had aged with the dignity of those who made consistent choices throughout life, completely white hair, impeccable suit, the habit of listening a lot before speaking. He had been the guardian of the fund since the first contribution, had executed every purchase with the discretion that Renata demanded, and knew the numbers as if they were his own. She placed the envelope on the table between the two of them. Felipe opened it, read it. Then he looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that mixed professional approval and something close to sadness. "Are you going to sign?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied. "I need to understand first what happens to the shares in the context of a separation, and what we can do so that nothing appears in the process before the moment I choose. Felipe closed the envelope. He spent the next 40 minutes explaining with precision all the legal implications, the risk windows, the available options. It was a complex scenario, but not impossible. The fund was structured so as to keep the stakes separate from the formal marital assets, a foresight that Renata's grandfather had insisted on including in the original constitution of the instrument. It was as if Antonio Braga, from some inaccessible place, had foreseen exactly this afternoon. The following week, Renata hired her own law firm, a firm specialized in corporate and family law that Eduardo did not know and that had no relationship with the holdings lawyers. The founding partner was a 50-year-old woman named Dr. Marcia Esteves, known in the corridors of the Court of Justice of São Paulo for her ability to transform apparent disadvantages into positions of real strength. Renata had researched for a week before choosing her. The meeting with Marcia was different from what Renata expected. The lawyer didn't need anyone to explain the scenario twice, asked only what she needed to know, and when Renata reached the part about the shareholding stakes, Marcia placed her pen on the notepad and stayed in silence for a moment before saying with a completely flat voice, "You know what you have in your hands, don't you?" "I'm starting to understand," Renata replied. "Then let's work with this the right way," said Marcia. "And right in this case means slow, it means invisible. It means that when the other party realizes what is happening, it will already be too late to change the outcome." Renata liked the woman immediately. While the lawyers operated in the shadows of the notary offices and arbitration chambers, public life followed with a disturbing normalcy. Eduardo had rented an apartment in Higienópolis, but still appeared at events beside Renata when the occasion demanded, a tacit agreement of mutual convenience that both maintained without needing to discuss. The formal separation had not yet been announced. There was a narrative to be constructed, and Eduardo wanted to control it. It was on one of these occasions, at a cocktail party for the launch of a partner real estate fund, that Renata observed Christian Mello closely for the first time, after knowing for certain what was between the two of them. Christian was different. There was a new security in her, the kind that comes not from experience but from the belief of having won something. She circulated through the ballroom with the posture of someone who already saw herself occupying a space that had not yet been formally yielded. She greeted Renata with a calculated elegance, the type of cordiality that carries within itself a grain of triumph that the other person is not supposed to notice. Renata returned the greeting with perfect naturalness, asked about work, made a kind comment about a recent communication project that the company had launched. Christian responded with a fluency that failed to completely hide the surprise of finding in her adversary something different from what she expected. When they moved away, Renata went to the buffet and drank a glass of water. There was no anger. There was only the clarity of someone who is in a game that the other party has not yet realized they are playing. On the other side of the ballroom, Eduardo observed the encounter with the discreet attention of someone who fears an explosion. When he realized there was none, his posture relaxed in a way so visible that two investors nearby noticed, and one of them, a man from Campinas who had known Eduardo for 15 years, commented softly that the founder seemed relieved for some reason. That night in the taxi back home, Renata opened her phone and sent a message to Felipe. "You can accelerate the process of consolidating the remaining stakes. We are on schedule." 3 words of response arrived in less than a minute. "Understood. You can trust." She put the phone in her bag and looked out the window at the city lights. São Paulo at night was an inverted constellation, bright and indifferent. Somewhere in that immensity, Eduardo was with Christian, believing he had closed a chapter. Somewhere in that same city, the papers were moving in silence, building a structure that he had never imagined existed. Renata closed her eyes for a moment, not from tiredness, from concentration. There was much still to do, and every step needed to be exact. The announcement of the separation was made in November, in a short note published by the holding's communication advisor, written with that specific language of corporate communications that need to say something without really saying anything. Eduardo Vasconcelos and Renata Vasconcelos inform, by common agreement, the end of their marital union after 22 years. They appreciate the respect for privacy at this time. The management of the company remains unchanged. Renata read the note on her phone, sitting in a coffee shop on Augusta where she had stopped to work. She placed the device on the table and returned her attention to the report she was reviewing. It was about the third-quarter performance of one of the holding's real estate funds, and there was an inconsistency in the fourth-quarter revenue projection that she wanted to understand better before taking it to the board. Messages began to arrive in waves. Friends, acquaintances, board members, partners from charity events, some people she barely knew, but who followed her on social media because of the couple's public image, all with some variation of the same question disguised as support. She responded to the most important ones with brevity and cordiality, left the others for later, and continued with the report. What Renata did not expect was the speed with which Eduardo chose to make the new relationship public. A week after the statement, Christian Melo appeared beside him in a coverage by Estadão about the real estate sector. It wasn't a photo of the couple. It was a professional photo from a company event. But the proximity was calculated, the angle chosen with care, the caption indicating their positions in a way that created a narrative without needing to write it directly. It was the work of a public relations director who knew her craft very well. Renata saw the story. She waited 3 days. Then she called Dr. Marcia. "How are we with the stakes?" she asked without preamble. "Consolidated at 93.2% of the planned total," Marcia replied. "The last lots are in process, 45 more days at most." Renata calculated mentally. 45 days was enough time. Eduardo and Christian's wedding was scheduled for March, as she had discovered through means that required no special effort. São Paulo was a city of 8 million inhabitants, but the business elite was a small and noisy village where information circulated with the speed of interest. The invitation arrived in early February, a cream paper envelope with her name written by hand, inside an elegant card with the symbol of a stylized ring at the top. Eduardo Vasconcelos and Christian Melo invite you to the celebration of their wedding. The location, Villa Fasano in Campos de Jordão, the date March 8th. Renata kept looking at the card for a long moment. It was an insult in silk wrapping. She knew that. Eduardo also knew, and that was precisely the intention, to display the triumph before the one he had left behind. It was the gesture of a man convinced that he had won and who wanted the defeated person to watch the victory up close, as a final closure. She confirmed her presence. The response reached Eduardo's advisor in writing, a single line. Renata Vasconcelos confirms presence with gratitude for the invitation. No additional comments. It is said that when Eduardo read the confirmation, he stayed in silence for a few seconds before showing it to Christian with an expression that mixed satisfaction and an uneasiness that he himself could not name. Christian said it was a sign of maturity from the ex-wife, and that her presence would only confirm how right and clear their new life was. Eduardo nodded, but the uneasiness remained. Renata spent the following weeks working with Felipe and Marcia to ensure that the last elements were in the exact place. The 45 days had turned into 30, then 20. Each purchase of shares was executed with the precision of movements that could not be traced back to her before the moment she chose to reveal. She also prepared a complete dossier, not of scandals, not of documented betrayals, not of anything that could sound like the revenge of a wounded person. It was an impeccable corporate presentation, with all the percentages, all the dates, all the legal records that demonstrated in an irrefutable way the control structure that had been built over 17 years. It was a document that any board member, any investor, any financial journalist could read and understand without needing interpretation. She delivered the dossier to Marcia, who reviewed it twice before saying, "It's perfect. Not a comma can be contested." Renata knew that afternoon that she was ready. What she still needed was a stage, and Eduardo, with the involuntary generosity of someone who believes they are staging their own triumph, had built the perfect stage with his own hands. 280 guests, all from the São Paulo business elite, all in the same ballroom in Campos de Jordão on March 8th. She went to the atelier of a designer she had known for years and ordered a custom-made suit in slate-colored fabric with finishes that communicated authority without effort. It wasn't a party dress. It was a uniform of arrival. On the eve of the wedding, while packing for Campos de Jordão, Renata opened the office drawer and took out the photo of her grandfather, Antonio Braga, that she had kept there since she had set up that space. A simple man in the photo, sitting in front of a table covered with papers, smiling with the expression of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone because the numbers have already done it. She leaned the photo back in its place and closed the drawer. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow is when the story begins to be told the right way. Campos de Jordão in March had that particular quality of light that altitude lends to autumn mornings, a cold and precise clarity that made everything sharper than usual. Renata arrived the afternoon before the wedding, alone in a car that she herself drove along Via Dutra and Rodovia Presidente Dutra, with the windows slightly open and the Serra da Mantiqueira growing slowly on the horizon. She had checked into a small and respectable hotel in the historic center of Campos, far from the two establishments where the wedding guests were concentrated, not out of shyness, but by choice. She wanted to arrive at the event without having spent the previous 24 hours subjected to the obligatory sociability of those who share a lobby and breakfast with the same crowd that tomorrow will watch a show whose outcome they do not yet know. She dined alone in a restaurant that served trout with local herbs, drank a glass of red wine, read 50 pages of a book on the economic history of Brazil. She slept well, woke up before the alarm. The wedding was scheduled for 6 in the evening, a civil ceremony in the garden of Villa Fasano, followed by a reception in the main hall. The villa was a historic complex that occupied a generous area in the Capivari neighborhood, with architecture that mixed European and Brazilian references in a result that sounded like old money without being exhibitionist. Eduardo had chosen the place with precision. It was the type of space that impressed without needing to shout. Renata arrived at 6:10 in the evening. She had calculated the time to arrive after the start of the ceremony, when the guests were already settled and attention was focused on the altar. She entered through the side corridor that led to the garden, discreetly greeted the person responsible for organizing the event, who recognized her with a slightly confused expression and found a discreet place near the corridor that gave access to the ballroom. From where she was, she could see the ceremony without being the center of the scene. Eduardo's back was to her when she arrived. He wore a navy blue suit that she recognized as being from the same tailor she herself had recommended years ago. Christiane entered through the garden with a white crepe dress and the smile of conquest. The guests applauded with that specific warmth of the elite when they approve of something that has been presented to them as elegant and inevitable. Renata observed everything with an attention that had nothing of sentimentalism. There were closures that needed to happen so that other things could begin, and this was one of them. She was closing a cycle with her eyes open, which was different from closing it with a destroyed heart. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to migrate to the reception hall, she entered through the main corridor as if she had always been there. 2 Holdings board members saw her first. The expression of both was the same: genuine surprise, followed by an admiration that they themselves could not completely hide. She greeted both with the familiarity of someone who does not need to reintroduce herself, asked about the family of one of them, commented on a governance report that had circulated the previous week. When Eduardo saw her, the color of his face changed. It wasn't just surprise, it was something deeper, the specific sensation of someone who had built a set with care and realizes upon looking again that there is an element that should not be there. He greeted her with mechanical cordiality, said he was happy she had come, said something about new beginnings with the tone of someone repeating a memorized script. Renata smiled with the same calmness that he knew and hated because he could never completely decipher it. Christiane was more direct in her version of cordiality. She was radiant in the specific way of someone who believes they have won a game that the other party gave up playing. She hugged Renata with the controlled force of someone who wants to demonstrate they are not afraid. She said it was lovely to see her there, that it showed how much they were both mature and modern women. Renata responded that yes, it was a beautiful day, and sincerely complimented the dress. The reception had the quality of great São Paulo business parties: serious faces wearing the mask of relaxation, quality champagne, and conversations that mixed performative affection with the constant vigilance of those who never completely turn off the professional mode. There were journalists from the economy section of 2 major outlets, which Renata had considered in her calculations. She circulated discreetly through the ballroom, passing from group to group with that ease she had built over years of events like these. She spoke with investors who had known her for decades, with directors who respected her intelligence even when they treated her as an accessory to her husband. She planted in every conversation the seed of a question that none of them had yet formulated. What exactly was the shareholding composition of the holdings after the separation? It was a question that no one asked out loud, because no one had the information. And precisely for that reason, the moment the information appeared, the impact would be amplified by the accumulated surprise. Felipe Drummond was among the guests. He had been a business partner of Renata's grandfather and maintained cordial relations with Eduardo, who had never connected the dots between the lawyer and the fund that Renata managed discreetly. Felipe met her eyes twice during the night and gave an almost imperceptible nod of the head. Everything was in place. At 8 at night, when the main courses had been removed and the champagne was circulating in the second round, Eduardo stood up for the toast. Renata placed her glass on the table and crossed her hands in her lap. Waited. Eduardo's speech was constructed with the oratory talent that had made him famous in business forums. He spoke about the love he had found late, about the courage to start over, about Christiane as a partner in life and vision. And then, with the calculated arrogance of someone who believes they can reduce a person to a sentence, he mentioned Renata. He said he was deeply grateful for the presence of his ex-wife, that it demonstrated a maturity he had always admired in her, and that he would like to thank her for the years of dedication, the services rendered to the family and the company, the elegance with which she had accepted their new path. The word services rang in the ballroom with a weight that some guests noticed, and none commented on out loud. Renata did not change her expression. When Eduardo finished, he looked at her with a smile that invited the final applause of farewell. Then someone nearby, an investor who did not completely understand what he was seeing, said out loud, "And you, Renata? Aren't you going to say anything?" The ballroom became slightly suspended. She looked at the man who had asked, then at the table, then at the 280 faces observing her. And then she stood up. The microphone was on the master of ceremonies table, 3 steps from her. Renata picked it up naturally, as if she already knew that moment would come, and had rehearsed the gesture so many times that it had lost any symbolic weight. She stood before the 280 guests with the same aplomb she had used for 22 years to sustain another person's image. "Thank you for the opening," she said, and her voice came out clear and calibrated, without any of the tremors that the room might have expected. "I want to say a few words about new beginnings, because I think this theme deserves to be explored with more depth than we usually do on these occasions." The room laughed lightly. It was a safe, generous start, the type of opening that quieted the audience. Renata knew exactly what she was doing. She spoke about the 22 years of marriage to Eduardo without bitterness and without nostalgia. She spoke about what she had built beside him, about the events she had organized, the alliances she had woven, the partners she had brought to the table throughout years of work that rarely appeared in the credits. Every word was precise, every pause calculated. The room listened with the specific attention of someone trying to understand where this was going to lead. And then the tone changed. She didn't do it abruptly. It was gradual, like the variation of light in a well-directed theatrical scene, an alteration perceived by accumulation before being perceived by the change itself. She began to talk about investments, about the discipline of building something over time, of thinking about structures when others think only of immediate results, about her grandfather, Antonio Braga, who had taught her while still young that financial protection was not paranoia, it was intelligence. Some guests began to exchange looks, others held their breath without realizing it. She told them that 17 years ago, she had created a patrimonial instrument with specialized legal guidance, that over those 17 years, through that instrument, she had made gradual and systematic acquisitions of shareholding stakes in different investment vehicles, that these stakes, consolidated over time with the patience that any good investor needs to have, had accumulated in a way that she herself had only understood in its totality recently. Eduardo had become motionless, Christian as well. The expression on Eduardo's face went through transformations that any actor would envy. Confusion, incredulity, the beginning of understanding, and then something approaching dread, all in rapid and involuntary sequence, all before 280 pairs of eyes that were too attentive to miss any detail. Then, with an absolutely stable voice, Renata said the numbers. 51.8%, she said. That is my consolidated shareholding stake in Vasconcelos Holdings. As the majority shareholder, I have the right and the responsibility to call an extraordinary meeting of the board of directors, and I do so now with the members present in this room, as provided for in the company's bylaws. The ballroom exploded, not with applause, with sound, with chairs scraping on the floor, with voices starting at the same time, with phones emerging from pockets and bags, with two journalists who leapt simultaneously toward the corridor, with board members who turned to each other with expressions that mixed stupefaction and the automatic calculation of those who need to quickly understand what that means for their own positions. Felipe Drummond, sitting 2 tables away, slightly raised his glass toward her with a small and old smile. Eduardo tried to speak. His voice came out louder than intended, with an urgency that destroyed in seconds the composure he had maintained during the entire previous speech. He said that was an absurdity, that there were errors in the numbers, that she couldn't do that that there was a protocol, that the lawyers would need to verify. The words came out in uncoordinated sequence, the phrasing of a man trying to react faster than he can think. Renata listened to him finish. Then she said, with the same calm voice, "Eduardo, the documents are available for any board member who wants to verify right now. Dr. Marcia Esteves, who represents my legal interests, is present and can answer any technical question." Marcia, who had arrived in the ballroom discreetly during the initial speech, briefly raised her hand from where she was, on the opposite side of the hall. The effect was devastating. There was no way to contest the gesture. There was no way to contest the numbers that Renata had presented with clinical precision before 280 witnesses who included the main minority shareholders of the holdings, 3 members of the Fiscal Council, 2 executive directors and journalists from outlets that covered the financial market with rigor. Any attempt to deny it there and then would be not only useless but counterproductive, and Eduardo was intelligent enough to understand that even in that state. Christiane became completely still. The expression on her face was of someone who arrived at a party believing she was the hostess and has just discovered she wasn't even on the guest list. The triumph of the night, built over months with the care of a strategist who believed she knew the territory, had evaporated in less than 15 minutes of speech. Renata placed the microphone on the table with the same care she had picked it up. "I wish everyone a pleasant evening," she said, "and thank you, Eduardo, for the opportunity to speak." Then she left the ballroom with the serene stride of someone who has nothing to prove and much to do. The outer corridor of Villa Fasano was lit by wrought iron lanterns that cast orange light onto the stones of the floor. Renata had reached that point and stopped, breathing the cold mountain air, when she heard the footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Eduardo. "Couldn't you have done this somewhere else?" he said. His voice was controlled, but there was a crack in it that she recognized as anger, poorly disguised as indignation. "Anywhere, Renata. Anywhere but here." She turned around. The lighting from the lanterns created an involuntary theatrical quality, and for a moment the two looked at each other with the specific intensity of people who knew each other deeply and now need to recognize each other from positions completely different from those they occupied when they began. "You did exactly the same," she said. "You transformed my departure into a spectacle. You sent an invitation to the wedding as if it were a kindness and not a calculated humiliation. You chose the largest stage possible to display what you believed to be your victory. All I did was show up on the stage that you yourself built." Eduardo took a step forward. There were decades of marriage between them, decades of mutual knowledge, and he knew Renata was right in a way that had no answer. This left him more disturbed than any counter-argument could. "This is going to destroy the company," he said. "The market will react tomorrow morning. The minority shareholders will panic. You know what happens when there is uncertainty about the control of a company this size. Renata considered the observation with genuine seriousness. "No," she replied, "it's not going to destroy the company. You will destroy the company if you react the wrong way in the next 48 hours. I have no interest in destroying what I helped to build. I have an interest in managing it in a way that corresponds to the real value it has." "You haven't participated in operations for years," he said, and there was an attempt to regain ground in his voice, an argument he had clearly saved for this moment. "You don't know the details of anything that happened in the last 5 years. You're going to sit in that chair and you won't understand half of what is on the table." She breathed through her nose before responding. "Eduardo, I know there is an exposure of 230 million in currency derivatives that was not disclosed to the board in the third quarter report. I know the project for the complex in Campinas is 8 months behind schedule and that the cost exceeded the approved budget by 42%. I know that the partnership with the Luxembourg fund that you announced in October was not formally signed because there was a disagreement on the tag-along clause. I know these things because I have always known, even when you believed I wasn't paying attention." The silence that followed was the type that is heavy. Eduardo stood still, processing what he had heard, and Renata saw exactly the moment he understood. It wasn't that she had discovered this information recently. It was that she had never stopped following, never left the game, never been just the elegant wife he had decided she was. He had constructed the story of a passive and obedient woman because he needed that story to feel like the only protagonist. And the story had been a fiction from the beginning. The side door of the villa opened, and Christiane appeared in the corridor. She had replaced part of the dress with a coat, and the dramatic effect of the bridal attire had given way to something more like a woman in search of firm ground. She looked at the two of them without quite knowing how to position her own body. "Eduardo, the lawyer wants to talk to you," she said, with a voice that did its best to sound normal. "He says it's urgent." Eduardo looked at Renata one last time. The expression was too complex for a single name. There was frustration. There was something that in another context could be called respect. There was the specific desolation of someone who realizes they underestimated someone for a long time and is reaping the exact result of that mistake. He went inside. Christiane stayed for a moment in the doorway, looking at Renata with an expression that had lost all the security of the woman who had crossed the garden as a bride a few hours ago. There was a question in her eyes, one she couldn't completely formulate. Renata faced her with serenity. There was no cruelty in what she said next, only the precision of someone closing a conversation in the only way possible. "You didn't marry an empire," she said. "You married a man. And now you will have to discover the difference between the two things without the illusion that one equals the other." Christiane opened her mouth and closed it. Then she went inside as well. Renata stayed alone in the corridor for a few more minutes. She breathed the Mantiqueira air, which smelled of pine and humidity and altitude. She thought of her grandfather, as she always thought in the moments that mattered. Antonio Braga had built everything he had from nothing, bricks, contracts, patience, and he had left her not just the money, but the method. The method was more valuable than any specific amount. She took her phone and sent a message to Marcia. "You can prepare the formal notice for the board meeting on Monday. I want everything filed before the market opens." The response arrived in 90 seconds. "It's already ready. Just needed your signal." Renata put the phone in her bag, adjusted her slate-colored suit, and walked toward the main exit of the villa. Somewhere behind her, Eduardo Vasconcellos' wedding party tried to reorganize itself after an earthquake that no one had foreseen, except the woman who had planned it 17 years in advance. She felt no euphoria. She felt the specific clarity of the moment when a long labor finds its natural result. And she felt for the first time in a long time that the next chapter would be written entirely with her own hands. Monday began before dawn at the offices of Vasconcelos Holdings. The protocol for the extraordinary notice had been delivered to the board of directors at 7:30 in the morning, as determined by Marcia, and the reaction was immediate. Phones rang in sequence through the floors of the building on Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima. Advisors arrived with coffee and expressions of those who had spent the weekend on alert, and the financial journalists who had been present at Villa Fasano published the first stories still on Sunday night. creating a wave of speculation that made the name of the holdings occupy the first position in the main business news aggregators even before the market opened. Renata was at the office in downtown São Paulo at 8 in the morning. Hers, the one she had maintained discreetly in recent years, now open with a normalcy that no longer needed discretion. Felipe Drummond arrived at 8:20 with 2 assistants and a folder containing, in chronological order, all the documents that made up the fund's trajectory. It was a 17-year story recorded on paper. Every purchase, every contribution, every reinvestment, every explanatory note that had been signed with the awareness that one day it might need to be presented. The stock exchange opened at 10. Holding shares suffered a fluctuation that market analysts described in the first comments of the day as significant but not catastrophic, which was exactly what Renata had calculated. There was a difference between an earthquake and a repositioning, and she had worked so that investors and analysts would see the second, not the first. The note that Marcia had prepared and that circulated before the market opened was precise in this sense. There was no management crisis. There was a transition of control that had been legitimately built and was being conducted with transparency and responsibility. The word transparency was a surgical choice. She had revealed the situation publicly, before witnesses, in an act that no one could contest as secret or sneaky. It had been surprising, yes, but it had been done in the light. Eduardo arrived at the company headquarters at 11 in the morning. Renata knew this through a message from one of the directors who had worked with her years ago and who had sent simply, "He arrived." She was not there to receive him. She didn't need to be. She had already called the meeting for the afternoon with all the board members, and she knew that Eduardo would show up because disappearing would be a much more serious mistake than facing what lay ahead. The meeting took place at 3 in the afternoon in a conference room on the 22nd floor, overlooking the marginal Pinheiros. Renata arrived with Marcia and with an economist specialized in corporate governance who had been hired specifically for that meeting. It wasn't performance, it was applied competence. Eduardo was sitting when she entered. There were 2 lawyers beside him, neither of whom she knew, which meant he had hired new counsel over the weekend. It was a sign of someone trying to reorganize quickly. The board members occupied the places around the table with the attention of those who knew they were participating in something that would be narrated for a long time. There were 5 of them, plus the president of the Fiscal Council, plus 2 executive directors with consultative voting rights. Renata opened the meeting without waiting for anyone to invite her to do so. It was her prerogative as the majority shareholder, and exercising it without hesitation was also a message. During the 2 hours that followed, she conducted the meeting with a precision that surprised even those who expected competence. She presented the fund documents, answered every technical question with clarity, explained the structure of the intermediate holdings without condescension but without gaps. When Eduardo's lawyers tried to contest the legitimacy of the process, Marcia intercepted them with statutory references that made the contests unfeasible. There was a moment when Eduardo made his only real attempt to regain ground. He asked for the floor and argued that, regardless of corporate issues, there was an operational continuity that depended on his permanence in management. It was a reasonable argument technically because Eduardo did indeed know the operational details of the company like no one else. Renata listened to him until the end before responding. "I completely agree," she said, and the surprise in the room was perceptible. "Operational continuity is an absolute priority. Therefore, I propose that Eduardo remain as a special advisor during a 90-day transition period, with full access to operations and responsibility for ensuring the proper transfer of management knowledge. At the end of this period, the leadership structure will be evaluated in conjunction with the board." It was a solution that no one had foreseen, not even Eduardo. There was a calculated generosity in that, and Renata knew it would be interpreted as such. She didn't want to destroy what she had helped to build. She wanted to take control of what was legitimately hers and conduct the process with the sobriety of someone who thinks in the long term. Humiliating Eduardo publicly for 90 days would serve no purpose that mattered to her. The board approved the proposal by 4 votes to 1, with 1 abstention. When the meeting was closed and people began to leave, Eduardo stayed seated for a moment after the others stood up. Renata was gathering her documents from the table when he said, without looking directly at her, "You planned this from the start." She stopped, considered the statement. "No," she replied with honesty. "I planned the protection from the start. The rest was a consequence of your choices, not mine." He didn't answer. She left the room with Marzia and Felipe, and in the corridor she felt the specific lightness of someone who has set down a weight they had carried for a long time without completely realizing how much it weighed. It wasn't victory. It was closure. In the elevator, Felipe said only, "Your grandfather would be proud." Renata smiled truly for the first time that day. Outside the building, São Paulo followed with its habitual indifference. Cars on Faria Lima, people in motion, the constant and varied sound of a city that doesn't stop for anyone. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk before going to the car. The real work began now, and she was ready. 6 months later, Vasconcelos Holdings had gone through one of the most talked-about restructurings in the Brazilian real estate market. Renata assumed the presidency of the board of directors in the first week of April, with an internal ceremony that lasted exactly 40 minutes and which she had requested be recorded only in minutes, without photographs, without a press release. What there was to announce had already been announced in the ballroom of Villa Fasano before 280 witnesses and 2 journalists who transformed that wedding dinner into one of the most read financial coverages of the year. She didn't need more visibility. She needed results. Eduardo's 90 days as a special advisor were productive in a way that surprised even the most skeptical among the board members. He was, by any objective measure, a brilliant operator, and when the layer of vanity and the need to be the protagonist of every situation were removed, what remained was a competent professional who knew the details of the business with a depth that was genuinely valuable. The transition was made with an efficiency that she mentally noted as one of the things for which she was grateful. On the last day of the period, he went to her office, which was now the one with the view of the river, and placed a flash drive on the table. "These are all the files that might not be in the systems," he said. "Old contracts, correspondence with partners who prefer not to leave everything on servers, a history of verbal negotiations that I transcribed over the years by habit." Renata took the flash drive. "Thank you," she said. He stayed in the doorway for a moment. "I have to admit," he said, "that I never imagined you were capable of this." "I know," she replied. "That's why it worked." Eduardo left without anything else, and she didn't know in the following months if that had been a closure or a beginning of something different between the two of them. She didn't worry about finding out. There were more urgent and more interesting things to occupy her attention. The derivatives exposure she had mentioned in the villa corridor was renegotiated with the creditor bank within a 3-week period, taking advantage of a favorable exchange rate window that Renata had identified with the help of an economist she hired from the same firm where she had worked at the beginning of her career decades ago. The project for the complex in Campinas was restructured with a new schedule and a reinforced management team. The partnership with the Luxembourg Fund was concluded after a round of renegotiation of the tag-along clause that took 3 weeks and resulted in a version much more favorable to the holdings than the original. Each of these resolutions was covered by the specialized press with the type of attention dedicated to something that has become unexpectedly interesting. The analysts who had predicted turbulence began to write about consistent management and unexpected leadership. One of the largest business magazines in the country asked for an interview, which she granted with precise criteria. 40 minutes, no questions about personal life, all topics exclusively related to corporate strategy. The story came out with a photograph of her in the office, standing before the window overlooking Faria Lima, the slate-colored suit, the expression that many still confused with coldness. The title was a question she thought unnecessary, because the answer was obvious to those who had followed the trajectory. Who is Renata Vasconcelos? She showed the story to Marcia during a business lunch at a restaurant in Villa Olympia. Marcia read it in silence, then placed it on the table and said, "They still haven't understood who you really are, but they will." Renata cut a piece of the risotto in front of her. "It is not necessary that they understand," she replied. It is necessary that the company works. Felipe Drummond visited her at the downtown office on a September afternoon, in a meeting he had requested, with the careful formalism that characterized him. He said the moment had come to think about the fund's succession, not because it was urgent, but because he was 64 years old, and believed that well-built structures deserved to be thought about in advance. She agreed, and the two spent 2 hours discussing what would be necessary to ensure that the structure her grandfather had started continued generating the type of protection that had been its original purpose. Before leaving, Felipe took a small envelope from his folder and placed it on the table. "Your grandfather asked me to deliver this when the right moment arrived," he said. "I think it has arrived." It was a letter, written by hand with the slanted and firm handwriting of Antonio Braga, on paper that had yellowed in the folds with the passage of years. Renata read it alone after Felipe left, with the office in silence and the afternoon falling slowly over the Viaducto do Chá down below. The grandfather had written, "Renata, if you are reading this, it is because a big moment has arrived. I don't know which one, but I trust it was worthy of who you are. Take good care of what we built, and remember that the most important name in this story is the one you will leave forward, not the one you inherited from behind." She folded the letter carefully and kept it in the drawer where his photo was. That night she left the office later than usual. She walked along Augusta to Paulista, which still pulsed with the movement of a Tuesday in Sao Paulo, and stood for a moment leaning against the avenue's parapet, looking at the city that stretched in all directions with its endless grandiosity. There was a continuation in all of that, not a closure. There was the beginning of a chapter she was still learning to write, and there was, somewhere in that vastness, the next move. End of story. If the story of Renata Vasconcelos made you hold your breath, put away your phone for a few minutes and feel that specific sensation of someone facing something that matters, then you know you are in the right place. Here, every week, we bring narratives like this. Stories of women who built in silence what others underestimated out loud, of twists that only make sense when you see the whole story, of decisions that seem cold but carry within them decades of patience and intelligence. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because the next story is already on its way, and you won't want to arrive in the middle of it. Leave in the comments what you felt when Renata picked up the microphone, and if someone in your life needs to hear this story, share it now.